Welcome to the AOA Future in Orthopedic Surgery podcast series. This AOA podcast series will focus on the future in orthopedic surgery and the impact on leaders in our profession. These podcasts will focus on the vast spectrum of change that will occur as the future reveals itself. We will consider changes as they occur in the domains of culture, employment, technology, scope of practice, compensation, and other areas. My name is Doug Lundy, host for this podcast series. Joining us today is Dr. David Martin. Dr. Martin is the Executive Medical Director of the American Board of Orthopedic Surgery. He also serves as Professor of Orthopedic Surgery at Wake Forest University School of Medicine in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. He served as a director on the board of the American Board of Orthopedic Surgery from 2005 to 2015, serving as the 58th president of the ABOS from 2011 to 2012. He was subsequently named executive director in October 2016. He went to college at Dartmouth, did medical school and his residency in orthopedic surgery at Johns Hopkins, followed by a fellowship in sports medicine at the Houston Clinic in Columbus, Georgia, and Union Memorial in Baltimore, Maryland. He's the former director of sports medicine at Wake Forest and was the Demon Deacons team physician for 18 years. And he also served as a major in the U.S. Army Reserve. Dr. Martin, welcome to the podcast series, sir.
Thanks, Dr. Lundy. It's great to be here.
And so David and I go way back. We've been friends for a very long time. And David, as you know, we're going to talk about the future in orthopedic surgery in terms of board certification. And I would venture to say there's no one on the planet that knows this topic better than you do. First off, we always address leadership issues when we talk about on the podcast. So there's a tremendous amount about board certification. You and I are huge advocates and apologists for the process of board certification. In your mind, how can you see or how can you make the value statement to somebody that board certification improves, encourages, and fosters leadership in our profession? I mean, there's a lot of ways that somebody could take that. Board certification clearly is an important thing to serve the public, which is why we do it. But there's also a benefit to development and exercising of leadership. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I obviously am devoted to board certification. I'm a believer in board certification. I think the process is incredibly important, not only to the field of medicine, but to the field of orthopedic surgery. I come back to our mission statement at the ABOS a lot, and that's to foster safe, ethical, effective practice of orthopedic surgery. And I think that's what we push forward is safe, ethical, effective practice of orthopedic surgery. Orthopedic surgeons are well trained in ACGME accredited programs. They know the right thing to do. But I think if you don't measure something just above finishing a residency and having a license to practice medicine, that we don't foster leadership. I think we look at the whole orthopedic surgeon. It's not just a test. It's not just demonstrating knowledge. We look at a physician's professional standing. We look at a physician's peer review. We do look at a physician's knowledge. We look at their performance in practice. So I think all of those things put together, I think, do push someone towards leadership roles. I think that, when I look at leadership, I look at forming a team and putting a team together. And I think when an orthopedic surgeon moves towards board certification, it's a team sport. They need a team to put all of those things together to end up at where board certification puts them. And I think board certification is a measure. And if we don't measure something, then it's not going to improve. And so I think we push people towards improvement.
And the board really, in a large way, serves the public. I mean, that really is the basis, right? It serves our profession, but the underlying thing is to make sure that the public knows that this person has the stamp, that they provide the requisite knowledge and quality of care and performance and practice, as you said, to be a safe and ethical orthopedic surgeon.
For sure. When we talk about safe, ethical, effective practice of orthopedic surgery, at the bottom of that mission statement is to serve the public, and that's to serve our patients. And we come back to that constantly as a board and as a staff to say, how does this make a difference to the public? What change are we making that makes us better at serving the public? And I think, as a board, one of our strategic principles is leadership in orthopedic surgery board certification. And we want our programs and processes to be at the top of board certification. So we are constantly looking at how other boards do things, looking at how we can measure competency better, how we can make our programs and processes leading to board certification better. I think that's another part of our strategic plan is to be able to evaluate and assess orthopedic surgery competence. And how we do that, I think that's the future, is how we continue to do that in a not only effective way, but also efficient way to help our diplomates.
So as you look into your crystal ball, and you clearly have an extensive amount of experience, both as a director, you were 10 years on the board of directors, and now being executive medical director, and you guided us through the pandemic. That was a lot of work then, a lot of stress on you and the staff. And by the way, you do have the best staff in the world. That's just an incredible blessing. But folks that work in the board office, they could teach Chick-fil-A a thing or
It's
even on customer service, you know?
again, that goes back to the leadership you talked about, Doug. I think it's putting a team together, and we function best as a team. And you're right, we do. We have a great team on our full-time staff, and we have a great team on our board of directors. And I think working together as a team and putting together that team is critical. I think to serve as you lead, I think is important. So not only to serve those people, but to serve the public and to serve our diplomates. And what we went back to during the pandemic is our mission and what our strategic goals were. And that is to offer a credential to orthopedic surgeons. And how could we do that still maintaining our dedication to safe, ethical, effective orthopedic care dedicated to patients, but also continuing to carry out our mission through the pandemic in some pretty stressful times for both our diplomates, our candidates, and our staff and board. And I think to try and stay true to those principles and have a team together before that happens is important. Before something bad happens, you have to have the team in place. And that's what we've tried to do.
Yeah, and y'all certainly carried that out. But with all this experience and knowledge, and you know this processes better than anybody I know, where do you see board certification, specifically within orthopedic surgery, going in the next 10, 15 plus years? What'll it look like when our children or our friends' children finish college, finish med school, finish residency, and are going to the Palmer House for their oral exams? What is board certification going to look like in your mind down the future?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think I come back to when people ask me to summarize the future in the smallest number of words, I think we need to increase the value of board certification and decrease the burden of board certification. So the thing that people talk about the most is obviously the burden. And we need to continue to look for ways to obtain the information we need with the least amount of burden to an orthopedic surgeon. And so if that means somehow mining the electronic medical record and that goes on under the surface, if an orthopedic surgeon is doing the right thing, I think we should bother them very little, so to speak. At the same time, I think we need to increase the value. So we need to make sure that our assessments separate orthopedic surgeons who ought to be board certified from those that should not be board certified. And so those assessments need to have a minimal burden, but at the same time, they need to evaluate orthopedic surgeons, and we need to look for ways to increase the value. And so that will be looking at our assessments to make sure they measure what we think they measure. And we are gathering more data than we have in the past. So I think we need to continue to evaluate that data, and we're going to get large amounts of data, and we have to look at how we're going to evaluate that and how best to utilize that, again, to make board certification more valuable. And I think it's critically important, something I didn't mention at the beginning, we have a privilege of self-regulation. And so a lot of people start out with that premise, I really finished a good residency program, and I read and I attend conferences and I attend continuing medical education activities, and I'm really okay. And so you should just leave me alone. And while that may be true for a large number of orthopedic surgeons, I think if we as a board stepped out of that arena, somebody else would step in. And it would not be orthopedic surgeons. That privilege of self-regulation is something we take very seriously, and something that I have continued to push, because as I've experienced this over 20 something years, yeah, it seems like, wow, I'm doing the right thing. Can you just leave me alone? We could, but the government, I don't think would put up with that if we just said, orthopedic surgeons are good people. They're going to do the right thing. We're just going to step back and let them go. I don't think our patients would put up with that. I don't think the government would put up with that. I don't think our payers would put up with that. I don't think the hospitals would put up with that. And any one of those groups would be less skilled and less qualified to set up a board certification program than the ABOS board of directors and ABOS staff right now. And I think they'll continue to add new directors and new ideas. And there are new ways to assess surgeons coming up all the time. And we need to continue to stay abreast of those and add those to our programs as they are appropriate.
So you talked about big data, which is absolutely true. I remember, and maybe we can even talk about the virtual practice exam that Jack Flynn, I think he led the effort on that back in the day, that really saved us during the pandemic, didn't it? But before we touch that, with the big data, don't let me put words in your mouth, but I believe that the board intentionally moves very methodically and decisively rather than in quick jolts, just because it would completely disrupt the entire system and folks would not know what to do. Would you agree with that?
For sure. Doug, you have a lot of insight into these areas as well, having served on the board and pushed many of our programs and processes forward. But I think we continue to have to take a little bit of a step back and say, you know what, when we make a decision, it affects right now 22,000 board certified orthopedic surgeons who have time limited certificates, and there are another 8,000 who have time unlimited certificates. It affects all of those people plus 4,000 to 5,000 orthopedic surgery residents. So that's a large group of people that is affected. And we have to look at people who practice in solo practices in small towns, and large group multi-specialty practices in big cities, to academic institutions, to smaller institutions, to surgery centers now. And so we have to look at all of those groups of people and make sure our programs fit all of those appropriately, but also evaluate all those appropriately. That's a challenge, to evaluate people in all those different settings.
But the board is not afraid to look at new things and do new things and be on the cutting edge. I've heard people say, why don't they do this? And I'm like, because they are looking at it. They just look at things very, very carefully. They just can't jump just because there's a new flavor out there. But having said that, y'all are looking at artificial intelligence, and I don't want to get into anything that's none of our business, but I know that you guys are looking at artificial intelligence now. And in the perfect world, how could you see AI helping in the board certification process?
Yeah, that's a great question. Before I answer that question, I want to go back to the previous topic, because I mentioned those numbers. And at the same time, when we make a decision, it affects 30,000 odd orthopedic surgeons and orthopedic residents across the country. But we also have to think about that number 30,000 as being rather small. And so when you look at board certified physicians across the country, number about 1 million, and we are just under 30,000. So we need to work together. That's where the team comes in. We need to work together and stay together. If we start to splinter orthopedic surgery, we will be in trouble when we look at the 1 million physicians nationwide. We're a small number, so we need to work together with the AOA, with the academy, with the board, with subspecialty societies, with residency programs. We have different lanes, but we need to work together. As far as AI is concerned, there are some very compelling applications. We still have to obviously look at those and make sure that they are secure, but AI is being used to write questions for examinations in some cases, and that's something that we need to look at. AI can be used to evaluate, for instance, surgical movements in the operating room. Could we have AI evaluate oral examinations? Those are things that we need to look at. Those are far in the future, and we are confident in our evaluations now. But I think, again, we need to continue to maintain our leadership role and look at ways to assess orthopedic surgeon competence going forward. And I think we will need to look for ways to utilize that the power of AI in our programs and processes. Again, I think it can decrease the burden a little bit. You mentioned the VP, virtual practice evaluation. That was something that we were looking at to try and evaluate an orthopedic surgeon's practice and to capitalize on the gains we had made in digitizing the oral examination. And could we evaluate a surgeon's practice without them being present by looking at the documents that they upload for the oral examination? And at the same time, we were looking at that and trying to evaluate that, the pandemic occurred. And if we had been sitting back and said, we like the oral exam, we like the oral exam being in person, and that's what we're committed to, and not have started to investigate that, we would have been in a whole different situation when the pandemic occurred. And as several other boards suspended their programs and processes during the pandemic, and based on the forward thinking of our board, we were able to continue our programs and processes and continue to certify orthopedic surgeons so that we didn't set their careers back several years.
Yeah, that was extremely effective during that time. The other tremendous feedback that I get from folks is on the WLA. Do you want to talk about the origin of the WLA and where you think the future of that is as we go?
Absolutely. And I think that points up the way our board evolves and the way we look at programs and processes. So the board decided in the 70s that probably for an orthopedic surgeon to be board certified for life, to go through the board certification process one time and say, great, I'm set for 30 years, probably was not realistic as medicine advanced and advancements were made rather quickly. And so the board said, we need to look at a recertification program. At that time, the decision was made to just repeat the certification program. And that's how recertification started, which morphed into maintenance of certification. And I think responding to pressure from our diplomates and also looking at some other programs that were out there and looking at how adults learn and saying maybe that's not the best way to just reevaluate an orthopedic surgeon every 10 years with the same program, and looked at something that was more longitudinal that would allow individuals to look at attaining knowledge and then demonstrate that in an ongoing fashion, led us to consider what we've called web-based longitudinal assessment. And we looked at various other boards. I would say with some pressure from our diplomates, pressure from our academy, and pressure from individuals and other boards saying, hey, this is working well for us, caused us to look at a longitudinal assessment program. We decided to base it on journal articles and knowledge sources, which are, again, journal articles, case reviews, those types of things, practice management documents. And so we decided to give that as an option to someone who didn't want to take a multiple choice examination. And it's been very successful. And orthopedic surgeons have appreciated that. It's actually has, in many cases, changed practice. I get a lot of feedback from people saying, hey, I read papers I might not have otherwise read, and that changed my practice in various areas. So that's been both gratifying on our side and I think well received by our diplomates.
Thank you. That's really good. So as we look at the future of maintenance of certification, what do you see potentially down the road for that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the four parts of evaluation that we have are reasonable. I think we need to, look at professionalism, and I think we need to look at continuing medical education. I think we need to look at some sort of knowledge assessment, and we have sort of three options right now. There may be other ways to evaluate orthopedic surgeons' knowledge, and I think we look at their performance in practice with a case list and with our peer review program. And we keep a close watch on licensure. We keep tabs on continuing medical education. And I think the advances we would make would be in performance and practice, how we can better evaluate an individual's case list and evaluate that in terms of how they treat patients. And then in terms of the peer review, better opportunities to evaluate that. I think could that supplant the knowledge assessment in some way if we were able to evaluate their cases, maybe in a more in-depth way? That is an area I think we will continue to find better ways to evaluate knowledge, and to continue to look at those will be important.
And earlier you discussed the value and increasing the value of board certification. Any thoughts on, and it's different stakeholders, right? I mean, there's the public, there's the board certified orthopedic surgeon, him or herself, and you have other stakeholders such as hospitals and insurance carriers and that. How would you foresee in the ideal world what the increased value of board certification would look like in the future?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I hope I'm answering your questions appropriately, Doug. I'm either trying to answer them or dodge them in a
You do.
roundabout way, but so I'll try that with this one too. No, I think that's a great question, and we have looked at that a lot. I think what we have done two things on the fronts that you mentioned. I think really we have tried to communicate to patients. That's a difficult task. I think most patients would think that either a hospital or a practice evaluates their physician. And so we have tried to engage hospitals and hospital leadership. And we have a communication program that we are looking at hospital leadership and surgery center leadership to try and communicate the value of board certification. And what does it mean to be an American Board of Medical Specialties ABOS board certified orthopedic surgeon? And how is that different from an orthopedic surgeon who's not board certified, and what an orthopedic surgeon goes through? So we do have a patient facing website that orthopedic surgeons can show their patients. This is what I went through to become board certified. We have some patient testimonials on there that say this is why these patients looked for board certified orthopedic surgeons. But then we also have a communication program. We've looked towards hospital leadership. And now we're looking at, do we need to go to physician hospital leadership, or do we need to look at executive hospital leadership? Do we need to look at board hospital leadership? And we're looking at obtaining lists of those people. And then we have started with mailings, really trying to get hospitals and institutions to look at their physicians and say, are your physicians board certified? And I think that's a way to increase the value. And we talked about the data, but I think we need to start to look at the data. And there is pretty good data out there, not necessarily in orthopedic surgery, but pretty good data out there that separates a board certified orthopedic surgeon who's participating in a continuing certification program from a surgeon who's not. Not all of that literature is in orthopedic surgery. And I think one of the things we want to do with the data is look at what separates a board certified orthopedic surgeon, and then publicize that to the right audience. And I think that's patients, institutions, third-party payers, and on down the line, and make sure we separate ourselves from physicians who are not board certified.
Speaking of which, if you're not actively involved in a academic program, you may not be aware of the resident skills assessment that will soon become required for residents to sit for the board. They're going to have a certain number of assessments during the residency program in order to meet that level in order to sit for the exam. So this is just an example I would throw out to you of what y'all are doing to more objectify the reasons. And if the other thing is, if you want to talk about perhaps, is that the board decided to increase its access in that it reached down into residency education, trying to help residents understand this is what's expected of you to become board certified, so that these folks can work on this during their residency rather than just waiting afterwards and hope they were good enough.
For sure. And you're referring to the ABOS KSB, or Knowledge, Skills, and Behavior Program. And you hit on a point that I've started to try to make. We honestly, from a board perspective, started that program saying, we basically say you have to finish an accredited residency program and then you can enter our program of board certification. And that's all we knew about that group of people. And we wondered what orthopedic program directors were actually, what criteria they were using to say, yep, this person's ready for independent practice. And as an assessment organization, we set about putting together a group of tools to assess orthopedic residents. I think if we flip that around, like you just did, it's valuable to residents because now they know where they stand along the way throughout residency, and they can utilize these measures, which the board has validated in orthopedic knowledge and surgical skills and in professional behavior, professionalism. We have validated those tools, and residents can now utilize those so they know. And the analogy that I use is they get on the highway of residency education and they roll onto the on-ramp after 4 years of medical school. Some have a lot of orthopedic experience, some don't have any orthopedic experience. They're going to spend 5 years on the highway, and we can help them get in the proper lane so that when they get off the highway 5 years later, they're actually competent orthopedic surgeons, because that should be their goal. I mean, they do want to be slick surgeons and the smartest person in the room and viewed as a professional when they graduate. And so I think, if you flip that around and say, look, we're giving you measures that you will get throughout residency to make sure that when you get off that highway, you have the appropriate orthopedic knowledge, surgical skill, and professionalism to function in our field. Right now, it seems a little bit of a burden to them. I think it's a little bit of a burden to orthopedic faculty. Hopefully, as we move along, it will just become sort of part of our vernacular and hopefully be a helpful tool. I mean, and that's something we'll evaluate. It'll give us more data to follow people.
So in 15 to 20 years, do you think the process will look remarkably similar to the way it is today? Similar, totally dissimilar? What's your gut tell you?
That's a great question. 15 to 20, if you said 5 to 7, I would say streamlined and improved. We're probably still going to be dealing with a similar process. 15 to 20 is down the line. I mean, wow, who knows how we'll be educating surgeons by then. There's a lot of exciting things out there as far as, the simulation. Does that get better? I think there are a lot of stresses on surgical education. It's not easy to educate an orthopedic surgeon and be sure that they are competent when they finish and able to be board certified. You know that. You've seen them at both ends, and I know that. We've been involved in this a long time. It's not an easy proposition. And so I think that part is going to change, and I think that will change our assessments somewhat.
And how do you see surgical skills simulation being involved in the future?
Wow. I think, yeah, that's a good question as well, because there's no better place to learn than in the operating room, and it's very hard to simulate that. But I think we'll get better at that. And if we're able to do that and that leads to changes in surgical skill, is that going to be a way that we can then evaluate surgical skill? I mean, on the other side of that is our assessments. And so I think we as a board have to look at also shaping our profession, because my mentor, Paul DeRosa, said, if they can teach it, we can test it. And I would flip that around a little bit and say that's true, but if we test it, they will teach it. And so I think the board has an opportunity to shape surgical education and shape the surgeons that are being produced by our residency programs. And so that's an awesome responsibility. And I think one that we have to look at carefully. So I think I dodged your 15 to 20-year question fairly well. But I think things are happening so fast, yet the board moves very methodically, and we still have to continue to remember that when we make a decision, we have to continue to come back to serving the public with and doing the right thing, safe, ethical, and effective care, but also the fact that it'll affect 30,000 orthopedic surgeons, and we need to make sure we stay focused on that.
So the board just celebrated its 90th anniversary, and you've been active at the board level, whether it was a director or as an executive director, for the last 20 years, since 2005. You've seen a tremendous amount of change. You know, the board does move methodically and carefully, but it does move, and it does make changes according to what's best. So what would you want to see your legacy of all the stuff that you've been involved with, which has been a substantial amount? What would you want to see your legacy, that executive director or the presidents of the board in the future look back and go, you know, that David guy, he did a great job in terms of leading blank. What would you want your legacy to be in terms of the future of the board?
That's a great question. One I've thought about as I move closer and closer to the end of my time in this position. And I would start with something I looked at just at the end of last week and this week when I got back from the Palmer House. The board was founded last year. We celebrated the 90th anniversary, so 91 years ago at the Palmer House. And I thought I need to look back at those records. And we have one page of minutes from January of 1934.
Oh my gosh.
A group of people met at the Palmer House and talked about forming the American Board of Orthopedic Surgery. And it's one page. And when you think about what that one page did over 91 years, it's pretty incredible.
And the AOA was instrumental in that.
Yes,
Yes.
the AOA was one of the organizations that was prominently featured at that meeting for sure, and continues to maintain a leadership role. So I would think my legacy would be what I would hope for is that we continued our leadership role in orthopedic surgery board certification, that we continue to make advances in all areas, that our processes are better for initial certification. That's our written examination. We have streamlined a lot of those processes and made that better, that we have streamlined the processes in the oral examination, the part 2 examination, and made strides in all areas of our initial evaluation, and that we've effectively pushed our continuing certification programs ahead to look at evaluating those areas that are important not only to orthopedic surgery, but to the public. So I don't know that I would put one single thing, but to have worked with incredible teams of people and moved those teams forward, I think in a role of really, again, serving the board and serving the public, I think is what I would like to see as a legacy.
It has been my absolute pleasure discussing the future of board certification with the Executive Medical Director of the American Board of Orthopedic Surgery, Dr. David Martin, who is also a life loyal Demon Deacon. So, Dr. Martin, thank you so much for being on the podcast, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the time.
And thank you for your service to our country as well, and your work in the Army. Appreciate that as well. And for the rest of y'all, look forward to seeing you again on another one of these AOA Futures in Orthopedic Surgery in this podcast series.